A shadow force born in secrecy, the Wagner Group's emergence stirred deep surprise and curiosity both in international public opinion and within the Russian political stage. Although it appeared to be just another private military company, Wagner's complex relationship with the Kremlin, operating as a non-state actor while serving as the state's covert instrument, granted it the qualities of an invisible yet highly effective strategic tool. In fact, Wagner's rapid rise fit neatly into the Russian government's doctrine of plausible deniability. This tactic allowed Moscow to conceal its direct military presence in foreign operations, reaping advantages such as avoiding official acknowledgement of military losses. The group first appeared in the Donbas conflict, where it actively supported pro-Russian separatists. Even before being formally recognized, Wagner was already utilizing Russia's military infrastructure, shared bases, military transport aircraft, and medical services, gaining both logistical convenience and the image of being deeply intertwined with the state. Its place in Putin's strategy was clear. Wagner enabled the Kremlin to intervene in volatile regions with minimal visibility. In doing so, Moscow could camouflage the true nature of its involvement in conflict zones while limiting official military exposure, thereby reducing political costs and the risk of public backlash. Thus, Wagner was far more than a mercenary group. It became a hybrid power center, playing an active role in global power balances and covertly carrying out the Kremlin's international strategies. While outwardly posing as a non-state entity, it drew strength from the Kremlin's shadow, turning geopolitical ambitions into concrete actions. In this context, the central question of the video emerges: why did Wagner evolve into more than just a private military company, becoming instead a strategic actor shaping global power dynamics? The establishment of the Wagner Group did more than create a covert mercenary organization, it also generated a deep sense of mystery and debate surrounding the strategic choices of the Russian state in foreign policy. Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin, who had a criminal record dating back to the Soviet era, later turned to entrepreneurship. Through ventures in restaurants and catering businesses, he built a discreet network that brought him close to the Kremlin, eventually forging strong ties with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Known by the nickname Putin's chef, Prigozhin not only provided catering services to the Kremlin but also expanded his influence into private security, media, and other operational structures. Prigozhin's role in the creation of the Wagner Group, as both financier and public figure, was strategically critical. However, the group's military leadership in the field was assumed by Dmitry Utkin, a former Spetsnaz officer, whose call sign Wagner ultimately gave the group its name. Documents reviewed indicate that the official founding date of the Wagner Group was May 1, 2014. On that date, an agreement between Prigozhin and Utkin formally established the organization. Yet, within less than a week, by mid-May, Wagner had already deployed to eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, and by May 21, 2014, its operatives were engaged in combat operations. In its early months, Wagner's operational strength consisted of roughly 100 fighters. By the end of that year, the group had expanded to around 250 operatives, comparable to the size of 2 motorized infantry companies. Although Wagner was never officially registered as a private military company, it benefited heavily from Russia's military infrastructure. Shared bases, transport aircraft, and medical services provided Wagner with state-level protection and support. This backing was not limited to logistics, it also created a framework in which the Kremlin, particularly Vladimir Putin and other officials, could deny responsibility for Wagner's activities, thus enhancing the strategy of plausible deniability. In June 2023, Putin openly acknowledged that the Wagner Group had been financed entirely through the state budget and the defense budget, officially confirming the long-debated link to the Russian government. Wagner first emerged in Donbas, supporting pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. Its early operations included reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and small-scale tactical assaults. Allegations suggest that Wagner played a role in downing a Ukrainian Il-76 transport aircraft at Luhansk airport and took part extensively in battles such as Debaltseve. Details regarding Wagner's founding, funding, and military structure have been examined in both academic research and journalistic reports. For example, the Hybrid Warfare Research Center published a study titled The Birth of the Wagner Group and Deployment to Ukraine in 2014 to 2015. Additionally, a report prepared by the UK Parliament offered a comprehensive analysis of Wagner's role and network. The book Death is Our Business further explores the group's origins, highlighting Prigozhin's instrumental role as financier and Utkin's military leadership, presenting an account supported by field testimonies and documented evidence. The activities of the Wagner Group extend far beyond the battlefield. They are marked by shadowy assassinations, silencing of witnesses, and systematic cover-ups of evidence. The strategy of kill, conceal, deny encapsulates the essence of these gray zone operations. On July 30, 2018, 3 Russian journalists Orkhan Zemel, Alexander Rastergaev, and Kirill Radchenko were killed in the Central African Republic while investigating Wagner's activities. Just 2 days into their inquiry, they were ambushed near Sibit, about 70 kilometers from the capital. Their expensive equipment was stolen, yet fuel canisters were left in the vehicle. Although the driver survived, authorities restricted his communication and labeled the incident a robbery. However, the investigative outlet Dossier Center later revealed, using call records, phone data, and field testimony, that the killings were premeditated and involved individuals linked to Wagner. In Mali's Gassi region, on April 22, drone and satellite footage surfaced showing Wagner operatives placing corpses in shallow mass graves in an attempt to simulate evidence of atrocities supposedly committed by French forces. Between March 27 and 31, 2022, in the town of Mora, Wagner forces operating alongside Malian troops were documented as having caused the deaths of at least 300 civilians. United Nations reports suggested the toll may have reached as high as 500. Nearly a dozen documented incidents further revealed that Wagner and Malian forces engaged in reckless human rights abuses against civilians, including multiple killings, arson of homes, and instilling widespread terror. In June 2024, a confidential legal brief submitted to the International Criminal Court described Wagner-linked atrocities in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. These included acts of torture, mutilation, and even cannibalism, disseminated via social media. The crimes were alleged to have taken place between December 2021 and July 2024, constituting grave affronts to human dignity. In war zones such as Syria and Ukraine, Wagner served as a power operating from the shadows, obscuring direct state accountability. In Ukraine, for example, Wagner operatives were reportedly deployed in assassination attempts against President Volodymyr Zelensky, highlighting their role as a covert but effective extension of Russian power. In Africa, this shadow strategy has manifested in the manipulation of physical evidence, arranging mass graves, concealing war crimes, and silencing dissent through targeted killings. These tactics have earned the term blackened files, symbolizing obstructed investigations and suppressed accountability. International human rights organizations have repeatedly documented these violations. Human Rights Watch reported that in Mali alone, at least 32 civilians were killed and more than 100 homes burned within just an 8-month period. In the Central African Republic, the murder of journalists was downplayed as a robbery, and official inquiries failed to adequately address the incident. The United Nations has further reported that in Mali, around 60 individuals were detained, tortured, and summarily executed shortly after interrogation. The UN urged that these allegations be investigated as potential war crimes and crimes against humanity. Wagner developed and entrenched a business model across Africa and the Middle East built on the equation: provide security services, gain access to natural resources. By intertwining military intervention with mining concessions, profit-sharing agreements, and political influence, Wagner established a lasting system of exploitation. Under this model, contracts directly tied to revenues from gold, diamonds, timber, and energy were granted in exchange for protecting local elites. Central African Republic, CAR. The U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, officially sanctioned Wagner-linked companies La Baie Invest, Midas Resources, and Bois Rouge, now Wood International Group, citing their income from mining and logging concessions. This serves as concrete state-level evidence that the privatization of security was systematically converted into resource extraction. A detailed study by the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, confirmed that Midas Resources secured a 25-year license for the Ndasima gold mine, while La Baie Invest simultaneously engaged in diamond and gold exploration within the same ecosystem. These concessions embodied Wagner's core principle: territorial dominance in exchange for resource access. The final report of the United Nations Security Council's panel of experts on CAR further documented how Wagner-linked actors infiltrated both the security sector and critical nodes of the resource supply chain, institutionalizing the exploitation system on the ground. Sudan. U.S. Treasury rulings and investigative journalism revealed that Prigozhin-linked M-Invest and its Sudanese subsidiary Mero Gold obtained gold mining licenses while simultaneously designing political influence and disinformation campaigns to reinforce regime security. This represented the archetypal Wagner arrangement, security plus propaganda in exchange for gold revenues. Another Treasury statement highlighted Wagner's financial infrastructure, pointing to companies such as Diamville and Industrial Resources, which manage the flow of precious stones and metals extracted from CR, effectively channeling funds back into Wagner's global network. This demonstrates how regional value chains were transformed into mechanisms for money laundering and cross-border resource transfers. Operational template. Investigations by the research group The Sentry mapped out Wagner's state capture blueprint in CR. Protection and military training for elites in return for mining concessions, trade monopolies, and leverage over local politics. The same reports emphasized that this economic exploitation was accompanied by intimidation and violence, instilling fear in local populations to entrench Wagner's extractive grip. Wagner's role in the 2022 Russia-Ukraine war. During Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Wagner Group functioned as a force to compensate for the Russian military shortcomings. By July 2022, Wagner began recruiting prisoners from Russian prisons and sending them to the front lines as reinforcements. In Ukraine alone, around 20,000 Wagner fighters were deployed, approximately 4,000 contracted personnel and the remaining 16,000 convicts. Between April and June 2022, Wagner acted as an assault engine in key battles across the Donbas, including Popasna, Soledar, and Bakhmut. In the battle for Bakhmut, Wagner emerged as Russia's primary offensive force. Wagner fighters operated under extremely high mortality rates. By December 2022, U.S. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby reported that about 1,000 Wagner soldiers had been killed in the fighting around Bakhmut, of which 900 were convicts. Some sources suggested that nearly 80% of Wagner's personnel in Ukraine were drawn from prisons. These convicts were classified with the K label and pushed into relentless wave assaults, attacking in intervals of 5 to 20 minutes. A former Wagner mercenary described the system as a human conveyor belt, explaining, "A group goes in, and within 5 minutes, they're dead." It happened every day. A U.S. report published in February 2023 estimated Wagner's total casualties in Ukraine at 30,000, with about 9,000 killed. More than 40,000 were reported injured, and half of these deaths occurred during the Bakhmut battle. Wagner was not only central on the battlefield but also became a major target in the diplomatic arena. The United Nations, European Union, and United States highlighted Wagner's involvement in grave human rights abuses. In April 2023, the European Union officially added the Wagner Group to its sanctions list, noting its active role in the conflict. Earlier, in January 2023, the United States designated Wagner a significant transnational criminal organization, granting Washington broader authority to impose sweeping economic restrictions. Additionally, the UK Parliament's report Guns for Gold, the Wagner Network underscored Wagner's role as both an active economic player in the global arms and commodities trade and a political actor shaping local governance while generating financial resources. Putin and Wagner, loyalty or threat? For the Kremlin, Wagner represented both a flexible tool and a latent threat. On the one hand, the plausible deniability shield allowed Moscow to intervene abroad at relatively low political and financial cost, masking direct state responsibility. On the other, Wagner's loose command structure and hierarchy built on personal loyalty created the risk of armed independence against the center. Policy analyses note that the very flexibility which made Wagner useful to Russian foreign policy also generated regime security vulnerabilities for the Kremlin. On June 27, 2023, President Vladimir Putin publicly acknowledged what had long been denied: Wagner was entirely financed by the state. He disclosed that between May 2022 and May 2023, Wagner had received 86 billion rubles, nearly $1 billion. This admission amounted to the highest-level confirmation of Wagner's legal and political dependence on the state, weakening the protective cloak of plausible deniability. The Kremlin's effort to rein Wagner back in took concrete form in June 2023, when the Ministry of Defense advanced an order requiring all private military formations to sign contracts. Wagner's founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, openly refused. Putin's public endorsement of the Defense Ministry's initiative was a clear attempt to curtail Wagner's autonomy and assertion of authority that simultaneously branded the group as a threat. Prigozhin, through his harsh and public criticism of the war effort, often targeting the defense minister and chief of the general staff in scathing videos, emerged as a destabilizing figure. His tirades about ammunition shortages and command failures exposed the Kremlin's dilemma between loyalty and effectiveness. Tensions reached their peak in the brief but dramatic armed mutiny of late June 2023. For 24 hours, Wagner forces seized key sites in Rostov-on-Don and advanced toward Moscow. A settlement mediated by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko led to their withdrawal. As part of the deal, criminal charges against Prigozhin were dropped, and he was expected to relocate to Belarus. The Kremlin sought to frame the crisis as an opportunity for an assertive display of authority, even as the rebellion revealed deep cracks in regime security. According to Lukashenko, Putin had considered eliminating Prigozhin during the uprising, a statement underscoring that Wagner was now viewed by the Kremlin as an explicit security threat. Just weeks later, in late August 2023, a plane believed to be carrying Prigozhin crashed under suspicious circumstances. Sabotage was widely suspected, though the Kremlin denied responsibility. His discreet burial and the muted official rhetoric combined to mark both the symbolic and practical erasure of an autonomous power center. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, concluded that the June 2023 mutiny exposed vulnerabilities in Russia's internal security and warned that so long as groups like Wagner existed, the risk of internal armed threats would persist. Analysts noted that Moscow's response was to tighten central control, seeking to restructure irregular forces under state institutions. In the post-Prigozhin period, Wagner's legacy has been reorganized under the Ministry of Defense and Security Services, with initiatives such as the Africa Corps emerging to place overseas operations, particularly in Africa, under stricter state supervision. International reporting indicates that many of these new units are composed of former Wagner personnel, but now bound more directly to Moscow's authority. Think tanks further caution that Wagner-type proxy networks, when drawn into complex conflicts, tend to generate spiraling costs and unmanageable crises, rapidly shifting the benefit-risk balance for the regime. In this sense, the shadow army is fluid and instrument one moment, a threat the next. June 2023, Wagner's march on Moscow. On June 23, 2023, the Wagner Group, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, launched a short-lived armed uprising. Having fiercely criticized the Russian military, Prigozhin announced what he called a march for justice, setting his forces on course toward Moscow. Wagner units seized control of Rostov-on-Don and advanced through Voronezh Oblast toward the capital. However, within 24 hours, the rebellion ended following a deal brokered by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko between Prigozhin and Vladimir Putin. Wagner forces withdrew, and the charges against Prigozhin were dropped. Though brief, the mutiny represented one of the most serious challenges to Kremlin authority in decades. It shook Russia's internal stability and fueled fears of eroding confidence even within the government itself. Exactly 2 months later, on August 23, 2023, tragedy struck. Yevgeny Prigozhin and several of Wagner's senior figures died when a private jet broke apart mid-air over Tver Oblast. All 10 passengers and crew were killed, including Prigozhin, Dmitry Utkin, and Valery Chekalov. Western intelligence circles quickly suggested the crash was a covert assassination, likely the result of a bomb or other form of sabotage. While Russian officials described the incident as an aviation safety violation, many international media outlets and policy analysts interpreted it as a Moscow-orchestrated operation. Prigozhin's growing independence and his emergence as a significant internal threat to the Kremlin were widely believed to be the driving factors behind his elimination. Prigozhin's death marked a turning point for the Kremlin. After the destabilization brought on by the mutiny, the regime moved quickly to reassert control. Shadow armies were gradually restructured under formal state authority. Some former Wagner fighters were absorbed into the Russian National Guard or newly established formations such as the Africa Corps under the Ministry of Defense. This restructuring aimed both to minimize the risk of another rebellion and to preserve Russia's capacity for overseas operations. The Wagner Group's June 2023 mutiny and the death of its leader in August 2023 permanently undermined the organization's image as a non-state, self-sufficient force. Yet Russia did not dismantle the structure entirely. Instead, to preserve its strategic foothold in Africa, Moscow chose to evolve Wagner into a new model. In this context, that Africa Corps was created, taking over portions of Wagner's operations under a different framework. Analysts in the United States, the West, and Africa continue to debate whether this represents a loyal continuation of Wagner or a Kremlin-controlled replacement. In Africa, the Africa Corps is not simply Wagner under a new name and structure. Rather, it is being built as a state-linked paramilitary model designed to bring operations under tighter Kremlin control. Expert assessments suggest that the rapid deployment of Africa Corps elements in countries like Niger and Burkina Faso indicates an alternative framework to the old Wagner network. Unlike Wagner's semi-autonomous style, this new structure has been carefully aligned with Russia's General Staff and the Ministry of Defense. Looking ahead, Wagner's ultimate fate remains uncertain should Vladimir Putin's regime eventually give way to another political leadership. Academic and policy circles outline three main continuity scenarios. Continuation through Africa Corps, directly controlled Kremlin structures such as the Africa Corps could emerge as Wagner's formal successor. Rise of other PMCs, private military companies like Redut, already more formally tied to the state and having absorbed many former Wagner fighters, may expand their influence. In Africa, Redut has reportedly established units such as the Bears Brigade. Full state absorption, some analysts argue Wagner could be dissolved entirely, with its functions transitioned into state-supervised, corporatized military entities. The Wagner Group emerged not merely as a private military company, but as a covert instrument of Russian state power, a dark extension of the Kremlin itself. With a force numbering over 50,000 fighters at its peak by the end of 2023, though declining thereafter, Wagner provided Moscow with the ability to intervene militarily while obscuring official state responsibility. Acting simultaneously in military and diplomatic spheres, Wagner evolved into a true proxy actor. From a security perspective, Wagner played a destabilizing role across Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. In fragile democracies such as the Central African Republic, Mali, and Libya, Wagner's involvement in regime change through external interventions, combined with resource-sharing arrangements with local elites, undermined already fragile democratic systems. In terms of human rights, the record is even more severe. Mass executions, torture, sexual violence, restrictions on media access, and the dissemination of amplified brutality through social media reached the level of crimes against humanity. Such propaganda not only normalized violence but also subjected populations to psychological pressure and intimidation, systematically weakening civil society. In legal terms, Wagner's conduct falls under outrages on personal dignity. To close with a striking reflection, one must ask, what comes next? Is Wagner collapsing, or merely restructuring? Russia's new Africa Corps, designed to maintain tighter state control while sustaining paramilitary networks abroad, is already reshaping regional power balances. Yet the potential of such structures to further erode democratic governance and replace law with violence remains dangerously high. Can existing frameworks, international law, democracy, human rights mount a credible defense against these threats? This question is not only one for states, but one that should compel global society itself to reflect on its future.